So this morning we welcome as the Craddock Lecturer, Dr. Douglas Sanderson. Douglas's Cree name is Amo Binashii, and he's Swampy Cree, part of the Beaver Clan and a member of the Opasquayak Cree Nation located in northern Manitoba. Douglas holds the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy and has served as a senior policy advisor to Ontario's Attorney General and Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Douglas has also co-authored, as you will have seen on the table on your way in, the book with Andrew Stobo Snyderman, Valley of the Birdtail, an Indian Reserve, a White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. This is the first Craddock Lecture since the COVID pandemic, so Douglas Sanderson today is renewing a long line of distinguished speakers funded 62 years ago by a member of Bloor Street United Church, Richard Craddock. As a scholar today, Douglas will address the question, what does it mean to redress historic wrongs? And after his talk, Dr. Sanderson will answer questions from the floor and from our Zoom participants. Dr. Sanderson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Reverend Ducharme and Bloor Street United, and thank you to St. Matthew's for this wonderful space. I want to thank Amanda Christie for making that beautiful poster. Family and friends, colleagues, and everyone out there tuning in on YouTube. Oh, also Beverly Stager, thank you so much for the invitation, all the work you did to facilitate this. You really made it easy. My topic today is historic injustice, and in particular the question of what does it mean to right historic wrongs. Now, I might have gone with the pithier title, Redressing Historic Injustice, exclamation mark. But the problem with that formulation is that I don't think we always agree on what it means to redress a wrong, let alone a wrong done a long time ago, maybe even generations ago. Now, when lawyers and philosophers think about righting wrongs, we generally think that to right a wrong is to put the parties back into the position they would have been had the injustice not happened. So, to explain what that means, let's do an example and ask a very simple version of that question. What is it to right a wrong done by one person to another in the present day? So imagine there are two siblings, Luke and Rachel. Rachel is a gifted musician, and her prized possession is a rare, one-of-a-kind Stradivarius violin made by Stradivarius himself in 1721. Now imagine that Luke becomes jealous of Rachel's success, so one day he takes Rachel's violin, secretly sells it, and pretends to know nothing of its absence. Now, when Rachel realizes her violin is missing, she is overcome with anger and fear. She has been violated by the theft. Now, how can we make this right? Well, to remedy this wrong, to make the situation right, all we need to do is to ensure that Luke returns to Rachel a violin. Problem solved, but not really. Imagine that Luke, feeling his sister's anguish, decides to make the situation right, and to remedy the injustice, as it were, he goes to Long and McQuaid, buys the violin, goes home, hands it to his sister. How does she react? Well, she's probably happy that her brother is thoughtful, but she only feels that way because she doesn't know that he's the one who stole her violin. But she's definitely not feeling like the situation is okay. What she had was $1 million, one-of-a-kind, handmade masterpiece, and what Luke gave her was a mass-produced commodity violin. A violin, yes, but not her violin. Luke, still overcome with guilt, his sister is miserable, she's crying, and he's not feeling any better, even though he gave her a violin. She wants her violin, and so imagine now Luke, overcome with guilt, suddenly hands Rachel the $1 million he obtained from the sale of her Stradivarius. Go buy a Stradivarius, I just want you to be happy, he says. Now, Rachel would be, of course, instantly suspicious. There's no way her brother has $1 million, but putting that aside, Rachel doesn't feel any better. Because while $1 million is awfully nice, it's not a Stradivarius. Still more to the point, it's not hers. So what's going on? Why is Rachel not happy? Yes, she's at one expensive violin, but we gave her a new violin. Not good enough. Okay, so we get that that violin is very special, very expensive, and so we give her the same amount of money as it costs to buy a Stradivarius, and yet she's still not happy. Why? Well, I don't think you need to be a legal scholar to know why. Rachel isn't feeling better because what she has is a random mass-produced violin. It's not hers. And the same amount of money as she would need to buy another violin, a Stradivarius, won't actually replace hers. They don't come up for sale very often, and each one is unique. None would ever be exactly like the one wrongly taken from her. So I think you can see from this example that what we're trying to do in righting wrongs is to remake a prior state of the world, to put everyone back into the position they would have been before the wrong took place. And the only way to do that is for Luke to give back Rachel's actual Stradivarius, not a lesser but similarly shaped violin, not the equivalent amount of money. The only way to make this right is for Luke to return to Rachel her violin. So that's the lawyer's way of thinking about what it is to right a wrong. Everything back in place, and when the injustice takes place between two living people, easy peasy. Unfortunately, when it comes to righting historic injustices that happened a long time ago, things get complicated fast, and in a couple of different directions. First, in our violin example, Luke and Rachel were both parties to the original wrong. They were both alive. Luke, the wrongdoer, Rachel, the victim, and they're both present when Luke makes it right by returning to Rachel her Stradivarius. But the historic part of historic injustice means that we're talking about wrongs that happened a long time ago, long before any of us today was alive. So that's the first complication in writing historic injustices. The people alive today, all of us, are neither the wrongdoers nor the injured party. People living today just had no hand in the original injustice. A second difficulty arises when we think about historic injustice is that we're not talking about violins or money. When it comes to historic injustice, especially between indigenous and settler peoples, what we're usually talking about is land. But land is a strange kind of commodity. It's not like a violin. Land is, by definition, big, really big. We can't give land back the way Luke physically handed Rachel her violin. Land is so much bigger than a violin. We can't wrap our arms around it. We can't hold it. We can't put it in a box. Land just defies return in the way that violins can be returned. So in the present day, when we see a wrong, we usually know how to right it. Luke has to give back the violin. But in historic injustice, remember, there's two problems. One, everyone who's a party to the original justice, long since dead. And so that means that their descendants actually have done really nothing wrong, nor had people, the living indigenous people today who suffered the wrong a long time ago, they are also all dead at this point. So the second thing that we need to worry about is, because we're talking about historic injustice, the thing we're talking about, the thing that needs to be given back, is land, and land doesn't fit in a box. So let us then consider something more like our current situation, something like, say, the Toronto Purchase. The Toronto Purchase is today known as Treaty 13, and that treaty is said to include two distinct transactions, one in 1787 and another in 1805. The details are, of course, complicated, but for our purposes, let's just say we'll stick to the very top of the line. In 1787, members of the Mississaugas met with Crown representatives to consider a sale. And this was not in itself unusual. Over the period from 1600 to 1787, land sales morphed from relatively straightforward surrenders of land by Indians in exchange for manufactured goods by settlers, But as the decades turned to centuries, these agreements became much more complicated. They became political and military alliances between First Nations and European powers. Land sales became treaties. So there was nothing unusual in and of itself about the Mississaugas considering the sale of land acknowledged to be their own. From the indigenous point of view, this was just the sort of thing you did for your military and political allies. You entered into agreements that allowed to share in the abundance of the land. Now, in the end, nothing came of the 1787 meeting between the Crown and Mississaugas. But 4 years later, a deed was produced purporting to be an official record of the sale. But the document contained no survey, and there's all sorts of other reasons to doubt the validity of the mysterious deed. Fraud of this sort was becoming increasingly common as First Nation people stopped dealing with settlers and instead started dealing with colonists. Settlers had to deal with their neighbors, so they largely made fair deals. But in the years leading up to, and especially after the American Revolution in 1787, colonists no longer thought of their Indian neighbors as allies, but rather as impediments to colonial expansion. Colonists in the Toronto area no doubt witnessed and were emboldened by the new American example of ripping off Indians as the expected outcome of every transaction involving land. So despite the obviously suspect origin of the 1787 Toronto Purchase, settlers poured in and started purchasing plots of land. Now, British officials thought the purchase was dubious at best and outright fraud at worst, but they took their time figuring out what to do. And all the while, land was being bought up, homes and businesses built, and lives established. Now, the Crown was in a bad spot. Title to thousands of plots of land in burgeoning Toronto were genuinely in doubt. In the end, the British decided to make the situation right by negotiating a new treaty, settling the old claims and securing additional lands for the growing city of Toronto. Unfortunately, this new deal in 1805 proved to be even more dubious than the last. A new map of the original purchase was produced, this time with even more land attached to the original sale. The Crown essentially carved out for itself the lands that go today, more or less from the lakeshore to the 427 and from the border of Etobicoke to Scarborough, essentially all of present-day Toronto for the price of 10 shillings, including HST, one presumes. So not really a good deal. Probably not even a deal at all, at least not in the sense of a deal being an agreement between like-minded parties. But was it an injustice? Yes, definitely. The original sale was fraudulent. The 1805 deal built in still more fraud. The price paid was laughable. So this counts not only as an injustice, but a historic injustice because it happened a long time ago. So what does it mean to right that wrong? What does it mean to right the wrong of lands that make up Toronto having been fraudulently purchased? What does it mean to return land that is now home to 3 million people? Consider our original example with the violin. In that example, Luke and Rachel were both parties to the original wrong. Present-day Luke did the wrong. Present-day Luke has to give back the violin. But the 3 million people in Toronto, including all of us right now, we are not like present-day Luke. Torontonians alive today did not take the land of Indian people during the Toronto Purchase. And yet it seems that to right this past wrong, we must remove Torontonians, I count myself there, we must remove Torontonians from their homes and businesses. And if we asked the 3 million people, they would say, whoa, wait just a minute there. I didn't take anyone's land. So that's going to be a problem. Not only that, but there's the same problem on the other side. The Indian people alive today, the Mississaugas alive today, they were not the ones who suffered the original wrong. They have lived their whole lives never having had the land that was taken from their ancestors in 1805. So imagine now, instead of thinking of individuals, let's imagine we're talking about wrongful transactions that take place between nations, or communities, or more simply governments. The Mississauga Nation existed in 1805, and the Mississaugas are still here today. Individual members, of course, have cycled in and out, but the Mississauga Nation is not distilled into any one person. The Mississaugas today, as they have always been, are an amalgamation of their living members. And we can say the same on the settler side. The Government of Ontario, the Nation of Canada, the City of Toronto, all of their precursor entities were around in 1805. And so if we think about it that way, then the parties to the original injustice are still around today. And this means that there's a way in which we can hold constant the original parties to the wrongful transaction. One government or one nation wronged another, and those governments or nations are still alive and around today. So all well and good, unless you're one of the people in Toronto who themselves didn't do anything wrong and who don't want to leave, and who see being asked to leave as an affront, an actual present-day injustice. Why should we have to give up our homes? We didn't do anything wrong. That's a head-scratcher. So how can we think through this problem in a way that helps us to get to a solution? Well, I think one thing we can do is step back far enough to see that a big part of the problem is that we see land as a kind of property. Now, I'm a property law professor, so one of the things I can tell you is that no matter what kind of property we are talking about, whether it's cars or pencils or preferred stocks or art or land, no matter what it is, the central and most important right of a property owner is the right to exclude others. It is very hard to say you own a car or an apartment if you can't stop other people from taking your wheels for a spin or sleeping in your bed whenever they want. In other words, having the right to exclude others is just what it is to have an interest in property. And therein is, I think, the core of our problem. So long as we think about land as property, then giving land back to Indian people is giving Indians the right to exclude others, because that's what it is to have property in land. To have a property interest is always the right to exclude others. So it makes sense that when we talk about giving back the land, we inevitably start thinking about current residents having to leave to make way for the original inhabitants. And this, of course, is a real problem. It's a problem for the 3 million people in Toronto who are aggrieved about being made to pay the price for something their ancestors did. And what about those people who have immigrated to Canada in the past 120 years? What about those people whose ancestors were never even part of this equation? That's a problem too. And what's more, this is a problem for us contemporary Indigenous peoples because, let's face it, no one is going to agree to hand over the homes of 3 million residents of Toronto. No one is going to agree to leave. And so it seems we're stuck. the tools that we use to solve simple problems like violins still in the present day, they don't seem to offer any useful traction when it comes to historic wrongs. The way we think about righting wrongs in the present day just does not give us the tools or the traction we need to right historic wrongs. So one way out of this mess is, I think, to reconsider our central claim that land was wrongly taken from Indian people. If that is the wrong, then the only way forward is to give the land back. And as we've seen, that is a very unlikely outcome. So what if instead of thinking that the land was taken, and so land must be given back, what if instead we imagined what was wrongly taken from Indian nations was something more akin to their right and ability to live good lives as Indian people? Let me give you an example to show you where I am going with this. Imagine that there is a farmer, and let's call him Farmer McLeod. Farmer McLeod owns a farm that he inherited from his father, as did his father before him. Farmer McLeod's farm has fences and outbuildings and a big house, and he's connected to municipal infrastructure like electricity, maybe even water. The McLeod kids are educated in a local school, and Mr. McLeod is a member of the local grain cooperative, while Mrs. McLeod works part-time in the town library. In other words, in short, the McLeods are like so many other people. They're landowners, and they're hooked in literally to electrical and other infrastructure, and they are embedded in a web of community relations. Now, imagine that one day a bus arrives on the McLeod farm, and out steps Bob, a senior civil servant from Ottawa. Bob explains that they're going to be doing some work on the land, and the McLeods need to get on this bus. They'll be returned tomorrow, and the McLeods comply. They leave on a journey, they return the next morning, and they arrive back on the land of the McLeod family farm. But the land is empty. Completely empty. And the bus and the road fade into nothingness as the McLeods survey their land. There's nothing. No house, no fence, no town, no neighbors, no library, no grain co-op or gas station, no roads, no cell phones, no towers, no electricity. It's all gone, scrubbed from the earth. Stepping back, can we honestly look at the McLeods and say, what are you crying about? You have your land back. Can we say that? I don't think we can. I think the McLeods have, in fact, a lot to cry about. I think that what they had taken from them wasn't land, because they're standing on their land. What was taken from them was their ability to live good lives, the lives they want to live and once lived as farmers, living in a modern-day farming community. There is an American philosopher named Jonathan Lear. And one day he found himself reading a biography of the Crow chief Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup regaled his biographer with amazing stories of adventure, war, leadership, sorrow, loss, love, fulfillment as chief, as warrior, as a Crow man. But when it came to the biographer's queries about Plenty-Coup's life after he was moved to a reservation, Plenty-Coup was silent. When pressed, he would say to his biographer, "You know that part of my life as well as anyone. You just tell that part of the story." And the biographer did know about Plenty Coux's life after moving to the reservation. Plenty Coux became not just a farmer, but an amazing prize-winning farmer. He won national competitions. He represented Indian nations at the dedication for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington. He had grandchildren that he deeply loved. But Plenty Coux would not talk about any of this, wouldn't talk about that part of his life when speaking to his biographer. The biographer persisted again and again and again. And one day, after a very long pause, Plenty Coux said, "After we moved to the reservation, our hearts fell to the ground, and we could not pick them up again. After that, nothing happened." Our hearts fell to the ground, and we could not pick them up again. After that, nothing happened. Plenty Coux's whole world had been taken from him when he was moved to a reservation. Stuff happened, but it wasn't his life anymore. Everything that gave his life meaning, everything that made it possible for him to live a good life as a Crow Nation chief, all of that was taken from him. Plenty Coux and the MacLeods, it turns out, have a lot in common. So I think it makes sense to think that what Indian nations lost wasn't land. No, land's part of the package. A true measure of the loss suffered by Indian nations includes the ability to live a good life in a particularly indigenous way. What does that mean? Well, think about Farmer MacLeod. For him, what makes his life meaningful, what makes it possible for him to live a good life as a farmer, he needs institutions like local governance and public schools and roads and a market for grain and the capacity to farm at something like an industrial scale. These are the things that make it possible for the MacLeods to live good lives as farmers in a modern Canadian state. Right? Without those elements, Farmer MacLeod can't live the life he lived before. He doesn't have access to the institutions or resources that made his life meaningful. He is a man surrounded by his family, literally standing on an empty prairie as we look at him and say, "You have your land back." For people indigenous to these lands, I think that the kinds of institutions that support an indigenous conception of the good life might include things like thinking about Indian families in terms of clan instead of nuclear identity. It would include the capacity for Aboriginal peoples to speak our own languages, to pass those languages on to our children. One of the central core wrongs of the residential school experience was to take the language. So for Indigenous people to live good lives, part of that package is not just to speak the language, but to be able to pass it on. It would include, for Indigenous people, something like access to traditional foods and medicines, and the education and governance systems that make those institutions possible in the first place. So let me try and bring together some of the threads of this talk. What does it mean to redress and right a historic wrong? I suppose the simplest way to frame this discussion would be to say, what does it mean to right historic wrongs, or why land back is the wrong answer? To talk about giving or taking land back is to talk about the loss suffered by indigenous people as a property wrong, a theft of a thing that you can just give back. And if we think about it that way, if we think about it as a property right, then we're automatically forced into thinking about the right to exclude others. Maybe millions of others. But as I think we can all see and understand now, that's not really what indigenous people lost. Yes, access to the land matters, but it's what happens on the land. It's the lessons that the land teach. It's our capacity to interact with the land, to learn from her, and to steward her. That is what indigenous people lost. Now, we've been using as our example injustices around the Toronto Purchase, and I've done this to play a strong hand. But since I'm the one dealing the cards, let me play a strong hand in the other direction. Instead of thinking about Toronto, let's think about Northern Ontario. There we find in the present day 43 First Nations communities without road access. They're accessible only by air or barge, and possibly for what is increasingly becoming just a couple of weeks in winter, an ice road. In these communities, these northern communities, there are almost no non-Aboriginal people. There are no provincial or federal government services, or really any services beyond bare bones policing and a nursing station. Now, in that kind of situation, we can see that the path to living a good life as a First Nations person in a First Nations community, it's much different than in the South. Imagine that we provided those northern communities with a big land base, big enough that they could impose taxation on resource extraction companies like forestry and mining. Imagine that hydroelectric projects would flow money into Indian coffers. What would happen then? Well, those communities would be able to invest in an education system that taught their languages and medicines and technologies. So now let's take that same example and make it a little harder. Let's sprinkle into that area in the north. Let's add in a not so small number of family farms or ranches, maybe even throw in a small town. Suddenly we have a not insignificant number of settler landowners, ranchers, residents of a small town, all living within this imaginary claim area, this area where First Nations are going to be given back the capacity to live the traditional lives they want to live. What of the settler property owners or the town residents? Won't they have to leave? Yes, absolutely. As long as we think that what was taken from Indian nations was land. But if we understand that what was really taken was the ability to live good lives, something more like governing powers and institutions that support Indigenous ways of being, then we don't need to ask anyone to leave because we're not interested in their property. Settler residents of newly First Nations governed territory would not have to give up their land. Instead, they would have to pay property taxes to a local First Nation government, and that government would maintain roads and schools and pick up the garbage and do all the other mundane things that make up the background work of modern governance. Under this conception of righting historic wrongs, what we're interested in is not land. It's the money paid in taxes by residents and entities like forestry and hydroelectric corporations. And with these financial resources and the power to make laws, we suddenly have the capacity to build our communities and mold our children in particularly indigenous ways, in the indigenous ways that we want, and in the ways that we once did. In other words, providing those things, the resources and capacity, makes it possible for indigenous people once again to live good lives as indigenous people. Because indigenous people would be living amidst institutions that affirmed their conception of the good life. The world that we live in now is all about a particular settler conception of the good life. All our ideas of goodness and meritocracy, they're all based in this particular conception of what it is to be a good person, what it is to live a good life. But an indigenous conception would look differently. And it's that difference, it's the space between that indigenous conception and the settler conception. That's the space where the loss has happened. I think that's what we need to focus on. And that's all well and good. But what about Toronto? Well, I think the same principles generally apply. To right a historic wrong like the fraudulent Toronto Purchase might well mean that the City of Toronto would have to disgorge a portion of its property taxes to the Mississaugas of New Credit. But wait, said 3 million residents of Toronto all at once. Wouldn't that make my property taxes go up? Yeah, it would. In all likelihood, yeah, all of our taxes would go up. But did you really think we were going to get through this reconciliation thing at no cost to you? And think of it this way. We, myself included, my family included, we have all been benefiting from the unjust Toronto Purchase just by living here. We've benefited from a past historic wrong, and it is inconceivable that righting that wrong won't impose a cost on others, on us, and we, the ones who've been benefiting all along from that injustice. But wait, there's more. Now, as Plenty Coup and Farmer McLeod have shown us, this isn't about land or money. It's about how we're able to live together under a condition of equality. In the North, where Indians are the majority, that's probably going to mean living under a regime where First Nations people have a great deal of law-making authority. In the urban South, in Toronto, it might mean significant political representation by First Nations people on things like city council and the various agencies that make decisions about how we Torontonians use the land. It's about political power and taxation that funds that political power. And in the long run, thinking about historic wrongs in this way, in the way that I've spoken today, will mean rethinking Indigenous participation in a wide variety of public institutions, including the church. Efforts like establishing an autonomous national Indigenous organization within the United Church are exactly the kinds of structural reforms that are going to be needed to effect meaningful reconciliation in the long run. First Nations people should be able to affect the church and not merely be affected by the church. And the same is true for our broader political institutions. First Nations people have, for the past 150 years, been affected by the rest of us, by our governance system, by our need for resources, by our need for energy. Aboriginal people have just felt it, been affected. Reconciliation, whatever that means in the long run, It's going to mean a world where Indigenous people affect our lives, where the things that they want, they need, I exclude myself there, that has an effect on us. And at some level, that effect is really simple. My taxes go up. I have to hear another voice on city council. It's going to mean, I think, in the long run, a much broader base of Indigenous political power. What we are talking about is a redistribution of wealth and resources. And I'm sorry that no one has told you that sooner, but it's true. It's time we all face reality, that this effort is not free, that we have been benefiting, and there are, in fact, means of making the situation right. For more than 150 years, Aboriginal people have suffered the injustice of having taken from them the ability to live good lives, including the capacity to mold and change the broader political and social world around them. Writing that, making good on the Canadian commitment to equality, empowering First Nations with resources and jurisdiction to build lives that have deep meaning to First Nations people. That is what it means to right historic wrongs. Miigwech, and thank you. Aho. Plenty of time for questions. Plenty of time for questions.